Picture this. It's the summer of 1847, and Texas is burning. Not literally, mind you, but the kind of bone-dry, soul-crushing heat that makes grown men weep and cattle drop dead where they stand. The rain? Well, let's just say the rain had apparently packed up and headed east sometime in May, leaving behind a landscape that looked like God's own abandoned skillet. Into this hellscape walks Jake Morrison, carrying surveying equipment that most folks couldn't even pronounce, geological maps that looked like chicken scratches to the locals, and something far more dangerous than any six-shooter, a secret that would shake this frontier town to its very foundations. Now, if you've ever been to a small town during hard times, you know how the power structure works. In Dry Creek, Texas, that power flowed, quite literally, through the hands of Thomas Whitfield and his coalition of established ranchers. These men controlled every shallow well within 20 miles, and when desperate homesteaders came crawling with empty barrels and dying children, Whitfield charged them $5 per barrel. $5. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $150 in today's money for what amounts to 42 gallons of muddy water. But Morrison? Morrison was different. While other newcomers either bent the knee to Whitfield or packed up and left, this peculiar man, with Cherokee blood running through his veins, spent his days doing the strangest thing imaginable. He listened to the land. I want you to imagine the scene. Here's this tall, weathered figure walking across acres of cracked earth, placing his ear to the ground like some kind of human divining rod. He'd study rock formations that everyone else dismissed as worthless piles of stone. He'd examine plants, noting which ones sent their roots deeper, searching for moisture that existed only in his imagination, or so it seemed. Morrison's grandmother, a Cherokee medicine woman, had taught him secrets that white settlers couldn't even comprehend, how morning mist gathered in specific spots, even during the worst droughts, how certain limestone formations could hide underground rivers that had been flowing since before Christ walked the earth, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of indigenous peoples, wisdom that the conquering culture had dismissed as primitive superstition. And then Morrison did something that transformed him from eccentric outsider to absolute laughingstock. He bought land. 40 acres of the driest, most ridiculed property in the entire county. Land so worthless that the previous owner practically paid Morrison to take it off his hands. We're talking pennies on the dollar for dirt that wouldn't grow weeds in a wet season. The laughter that erupted from Murphy's saloon could probably be heard in the next county. Picture Thomas Whitfield, this cattle baron who controlled life and death through water rights, doubled over with mirth. His rancher friends, men who measured their worth in head of cattle and acres under control, slapping the bar and wiping tears from their eyes. Crazy Jake, they called him, Fool's Gold Jake, after he started examining every rock like it might contain treasure. But Morrison had something these men lacked. He'd done his homework. While they were busy counting cattle and calculating profits, he'd been studying geological surveys that dated back to Spanish missionaries. He'd consulted with Comanche guides about ancestral water sources, piecing together a puzzle that had been scattered across centuries of human habitation. What Morrison discovered would make your head spin. That worthless land of his? It sat directly atop what geologists call an anticline formation. Think of it as an underground mountain of rock that could trap water at depths no one in 1847 had ever dreamed of reaching. We're talking about water that had been flowing beneath their feet since the age of dinosaurs, completely invisible to men who thought a 40-foot well was the pinnacle of engineering achievement. When Morrison announced his intention to dig deeper than 200 feet, the entire town treated it like the greatest entertainment since the traveling circus. They called it Crazy Jake's Funeral Hole, because surely anyone foolish enough to dig that deep would either strike hell itself or get swallowed by the earth. The mockery reached fever pitch when Morrison started assembling his team. Instead of hiring experienced well diggers or established workers, he recruited what polite society considered the dregs of the frontier, Chen Wei, a Chinese railroad worker who understood controlled explosives, but was banned from most establishments because of his race. Samuel Freeman, a formerly enslaved man who possessed African techniques for finding water through soil analysis and termite mound observation, knowledge that could save lives but was dismissed because of the color of his skin. Maria Gonzalez, whose grandfather had documented underground streams for Spanish missions, but whose expertise was ignored because she was both Mexican and female. Thomas Whitfield, ever the showman, publicly offered to buy Morrison a tombstone for when the hole swallows him whole. The local newspaper, all 4 pages of it, ran political cartoons showing Morrison digging straight through to China, with captions like, "Local man attempts to drain the Pacific Ocean." But here's what those laughing ranchers couldn't know. Morrison was playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. Every taunt, every refusal of assistance, every attempt to buy his land for pennies was being carefully documented. Morrison kept meticulous records, building a legal case while everyone assumed he was just an obsessed fool chasing impossible dreams. As summer burned toward autumn, with the drought showing no signs of breaking, Morrison and his unlikely team began their descent into the earth. Each shovelful of dirt removed was a step toward either vindication or disaster. The town gathered daily to watch progress on what they'd started calling the hole to nowhere, placing bets on how long before Morrison came to his senses. Little did they know that beneath their feet lay an underground river system that had been flowing since before their grandfathers were born, waiting for someone brave enough, or crazy enough, to dig deep enough to find it. But reaching that water would require Morrison and his team to descend into a darkness that would test every limit of human endurance and ingenuity. Because in 1847, digging 200 feet into the earth wasn't just ambitious, it was a journey into the unknown that would either save a dying community or bury its would-be savior alive. By 1848, Morrison's well had transformed into something unprecedented on the American frontier, a vertical battlefield that plunged 60 feet into the earth, where each dawn brought new dangers that would have sent lesser men running for the safety of shallow water and conventional wisdom. Imagine, if you will, descending into this shaft. Picture yourself climbing down a ladder made from salvaged railroad ties, leaving behind the familiar world of Texas sky, and entering a realm where the sun becomes a distant memory and every breath could be your last. This wasn't just hole digging. This was exploration into an alien environment that no human being in that part of Texas had ever experienced. The first crisis nearly killed Chen Wei, and it taught Morrison's team a lesson that would revolutionize deep drilling across the American West. Methane gas, invisible, odorless, and deadly, had been seeping from rock formations deep underground. Chen Wei descended for his morning shift, and within minutes he'd collapsed, unconscious and turning blue. Samuel Freeman, working above, heard the thud and immediately understood what every coal miner dreaded. Without hesitation, he rappelled down using nothing but rope and pure desperation, hauled Chen Wei to the surface, and spent 20 minutes breathing life back into his lungs. That near-death experience birthed an innovation that engineering schools would later study for decades. Chen Wei, drawing from his experience in railroad tunnels, designed a ventilation system using bamboo pipes that created airflow patterns 60 feet underground. Think about the ingenuity required here. They had to calculate air pressure, understand gas density, and create circulation using nothing but bamboo, rope, and determination. No textbooks, no professors, just 4 people solving problems that would stump modern engineers. Samuel Freeman's contribution was equally revolutionary. Using techniques his grandfather had learned in African gold mines, combined with salvaged railroad equipment, he created a pulley system that could lift 1,000 pounds of rock and dirt in a single haul. Picture this contraption, a massive wooden framework that towered above the prairie, with steel cables and counterweights that allowed 2 men to do the work of 20. Neighboring ranchers would ride over just to watch this mechanical marvel in operation, shaking their heads in amazement while still muttering about Morrison's madness. But it was Maria Gonzalez who made perhaps the most important discovery of all. As the team dug deeper, she carefully mapped every geological layer they passed through. At 40 feet, she found something that changed everything: fossil shells. Marine fossils, embedded in rock layers that proved ancient seas had once covered all of Texas. For Morrison, this wasn't just geological curiosity. It was confirmation that massive water systems had existed here for millions of years, water that might still flow far beneath the surface. The work itself created its own culture in that darkness below. These 4 people, Cherokee, Chinese, African American, and Mexican, developed something beautiful and strange. They sang work songs that blended Cherokee water chants with African rhythm patterns and Chinese miners' melodies, timing their pickaxe swings to beats that echoed off stone walls. When you're working in near-total darkness, sound becomes everything. Their voices created a symphony that rose from the earth each morning, audible to anyone passing by Morrison's property. They developed 37 different words for types of rock and soil, terms like whisper stone for limestone that cracked easily, devil dirt for clay that stuck to everything, and promise rock for the water-worn stones that suggested underground rivers. They created hand signals for silent communication when gas dangers required absolute quiet. Most remarkably, they instituted a ritual where each person touched a piece of turquoise, Morrison's grandmother's parting gift, before descending each day, connecting their dangerous work to ancient Cherokee beliefs about water spirits. Something extraordinary was happening above ground, too. The daily spectacle of Morrison's impossible project began attracting more than just mockery. Children started bringing food to the workers, fascinated by the mechanical contraptions and the strange music rising from the earth. Wives began sharing family stories about water dowsing and traditional techniques for finding springs. Even skeptical ranchers found themselves drawn to the growing abyss, peering into depths that challenged everything they thought they knew about the land beneath their feet. Then came the day that nearly ended everything, and paradoxically, transformed Morrison from laughingstock to local legend. At 93 feet down, Morrison was working alone at the bottom when the western wall simply gave way. Picture this. Tons of limestone, loosened by weeks of vibration from pickaxe work, suddenly collapsing in a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles. In seconds, Jake Morrison vanished beneath a mountain of rock and dirt. For 3 days, Dry Creek held its breath. The rescue effort became a community obsession that crossed every social boundary that had previously divided the town. Chen Wei used precisely calculated explosive charges to create rescue tunnels, work so dangerous that a single miscalculation would have brought down the entire shaft. Samuel Freeman organized bucket brigades that worked through the night, with participants ranging from Mexican laborers to the wives of wealthy ranchers. Even Thomas Whitfield sent his men to help, not from sudden compassion, but from fear that Morrison's death would bring unwanted legal scrutiny to water rights throughout the county. Maria Gonzalez proved to be the rescue's true architect. Using her geological knowledge, she calculated exactly where Morrison might have survived the collapse, identifying air pockets and structural weak points. She directed the rescue tunnels with the precision of a military engineer, working 72 hours straight while the town prayed and waited. When they finally pulled Morrison from the rubble, broken but breathing, his first words became frontier legend. "We're close. I can taste the water in the rocks." Some said the accident had driven him insane. Others whispered that he'd been touched by something deeper than madness, some connection to the earth that rational men couldn't understand. The near-death experience transformed the town's attitude toward Morrison's project. Mockery didn't disappear entirely, but it mixed now with grudging respect for anyone crazy enough, or brave enough, to risk death for an impossible dream. Thomas Whitfield, sensing shifting community sentiment, began spreading new rumors that the accident had damaged Morrison's mind, that his talk of tasting water was the rambling of a brain-addled fool. But Morrison wasn't addled. He was closer than ever to vindication. At 170 feet, his pick struck something that made his heart race. Smooth, water-worn river rock that had no business being so far underground. Behind it lay a cavern where water dripped steadily, fed by an aquifer that had been flowing since the age of dinosaurs. But drops wouldn't save Dry Creek. Morrison knew they needed to dig another 40 feet to reach the main water chamber, a feat that would require every ounce of ingenuity and courage his team possessed. As they prepared for the final descent, none of them could imagine that their greatest test still lay ahead, not just in the depths they had yet to reach, but in the drought that was already gathering on the horizon, a drought that would transform their impossible well from local curiosity into the difference between life and death for thousands of people across the Texas frontier. The Great Drought of 1883 didn't arrive like a normal weather pattern. It descended like a biblical plague, transforming the Texas landscape into something that resembled the surface of Mars more than the American frontier. This wasn't just dry weather, folks. This was nature declaring war on human civilization. Temperatures reaching 118 degrees in whatever shade you could find, with humidity so low that wooden buildings began splitting apart, and metal tools became too hot to touch with bare hands. Rivers that had flowed since the age of mastodons, waterways that indigenous peoples had depended on for thousands of years, simply vanished. The Guadalupe River became a series of disconnected pools, then mudflats, then cracked earth so hard you could drive a wagon across what had once been flowing water. The Colorado River retreated to a trickle that wouldn't fill a horse trough. Even the mighty Brazos, which pioneers had once feared for its flooding, dwindled to a chain of stagnant ponds that bred mosquitoes and disease. Dry Creek's 15 shallow wells failed in a predictable pattern that revealed the brutal hierarchy of frontier water access. First to go dry were the homesteaders' simple hand-dug holes, 30-foot affairs that had seemed adequate during normal times. These families, German immigrants, freed slaves trying to build new lives, Mexican settlers, whose ancestors had farmed this land for generations, found themselves staring into empty holes that mocked their dreams of independence. Next came the more established ranchers' wells, 40- and 50-foot operations that had been the pride of men who thought they understood the land. Thomas Whitfield's own well, his 40-foot monument to water dominance, produced its last bucket of muddy liquid in July of 1883. Picture the panic in his eyes as he realized that all his power, all his control over life and death in Dry Creek, was evaporating like morning dew. By August, desperate families were engaging in survival behaviors that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. They dug up barrel cacti, slicing them open to extract what little moisture these desert plants had stored. Cattle, those symbols of frontier wealth, were being bled for their blood to drink, a practice so desperate it would have made hardened soldiers weep. Children were dying of dehydration in their mothers' arms, while their fathers rode 50 miles, searching for any source of water that hadn't yet failed. But Morrison's well, that impossible, laughable 212-foot monument to one man's obsession, flowed like it was connected to the rivers of paradise. The water emerged cold and crystal clear, tasting of minerals from geological ages when dinosaurs roamed the earth. 30 gallons per minute, every hour, every day, when every other source of water for hundreds of miles had vanished into the relentless Texas heat. The first person to come begging was someone who would have died. Before asking Morrison for help under normal circumstances, Sarah Whitfield, Thomas's own wife, carrying her fevered infant daughter. Picture this scene, the wife of the man who had mocked Morrison for years, standing at the edge of the well that her husband had called Crazy Jake's funeral hole, holding a baby whose life depended on water from the depths her family had ridiculed. Morrison's response revealed the character of a man who understood that water transcends all human petty divisions. He gave freely, asking only that Sarah tell others the water was available to all who needed it. Not revenge, not gloating, just the simple recognition that dying children don't care about their parents' politics or prejudices. Within days, wagon trains stretched for miles across the Texas prairie, looking like something from the California gold rush, but carrying empty barrels instead of mining equipment. Families came from settlements as far as San Antonio, traveling for weeks across sun-baked wasteland with their last surviving animals, following rumors of the miracle well at Dry Creek. The distribution system Morrison created was a masterpiece of both strategy and frontier justice. Those who had mocked him and his team paid 25 cents per barrel, not price gouging, but enough to fund the operation and maintain the equipment that kept the water flowing. Those who had helped during the dangerous digging years received water free, honoring debts of courage and friendship that transcended monetary value. Most remarkably, Morrison established a policy that indigenous families, Mexican settlers, and freed slaves paid nothing for water. This wasn't charity. It was recognition that their ancestors' knowledge had made the well possible in the first place. Cherokee understanding of geological formations, African techniques for reading soil and underground water signs, Mexican documentation of ancient water sources. Without this inherited wisdom, Morrison's well would never have existed. Morrison stationed his original team as water guardians, preventing the violence that erupted at other surviving wells across drought-stricken Texas. Chen Wei, Samuel Freeman, and Maria Gonzalez became the sheriffs of salvation, ensuring that desperate people didn't kill each other fighting over access to life itself. Their presence turned water distribution into something approaching a sacred ritual rather than a frenzied battle for survival. When Thomas Whitfield arrived with armed men, demanding control of the well that could save or damn the entire region, he found something that must have shocked him to his core. The entire community, white homesteaders, Mexican families, freed slaves, even some of his former allies, standing together at the well's edge, unified by the shared recognition that Morrison's impossible dream had become their only salvation. The drought stretched for 7 brutal years, killing an estimated 10,000 head of cattle and forcing the abandonment of 43 towns across Texas. Ghost towns that had once boasted hundreds of residents became clusters of empty buildings, slowly being reclaimed by the desert. But Morrison's well never faltered, never slowed, eventually supplying water to 3,000 people daily from a source that seemed to tap into the very heart of the earth. Morrison used the profits from his water sales to dig 6 more deep wells across the county, each one breaking the stranglehold of water monopoly that had kept frontier communities at the mercy of men like Whitfield. These new wells, employing the techniques Morrison's team had pioneered, created a network of deep water sources that transformed the social and economic structure of the entire region. The Texas state legislature, influenced by Morrison's meticulous documentation of water hoarding and price manipulation during the drought years, passed the Deepwater Rights Act of 1885. This legislation forever changed resource law across the American West, establishing principles of water access that would influence legal systems for generations to come. Thomas Whitfield, his cattle empire destroyed and his water monopoly broken, left for California with the remnants of his fortune. The man who had once controlled life and death through shallow wells couldn't adapt to a world where water flowed from depths he'd never imagined possible. Morrison's multicultural coalition became the new civic leadership of a transformed Dry Creek, proving that survival in impossible circumstances creates bonds stronger than the prejudices that divide communities during easier times. The well that had begun as one man's obsession had become the foundation of a new kind of frontier society, one built not on domination of natural resources, but on the wisdom to dig deep enough to find the abundance that lay hidden beneath everyone's feet. Jake Morrison lived to see his obsession transform the American frontier's entire relationship with water, though the personal cost of his vision would haunt him until his final breath. By 1890, his Deep Wells Company had drilled 70 successful wells across 5 states, each one employing the revolutionary techniques that had been born in the darkness beneath Dry Creek, reading geological signs that others ignored, using controlled explosives with surgical precision, and creating ventilation systems that made extreme depths survivable for the first time in human history. His original team had become legends in their own right, proof that innovation emerges from the margins of society, where desperate necessity meets unconventional wisdom. Chen Wei established the Western States Drilling Academy in Colorado, where he taught 2 generations of engineers the explosive techniques that had once nearly killed him in Morrison's shaft. Samuel Freeman wrote what became the definitive manual on deep aquifer detection, a book that combined African traditional knowledge with frontier innovation in ways that revolutionized water location across the American West. Maria Gonzalez shattered every expectation of what a woman could achieve in 1880s America, becoming Texas's first licensed female water engineer and designing well systems that supplied entire cities. But the personal cost of Morrison's obsession revealed itself in the quiet moments that history rarely records. His wife Emma, whom he married in 1886 during a brief respite from his endless travels, spoke years later of nights when he would wake screaming, reliving his burial in the collapse that had nearly ended everything. The sound of shifting earth, even something as innocent as loose gravel on a roof, would send him into panic attacks that left him shaking and unable to breathe. His daughter Sarah, born during a thunderstorm that broke a minor drought in 1887, grew up with memories of her father's daily ritual, standing at the original well's edge each dawn, dropping a pebble into the depths and counting the seconds until the splash echoed back from 212 feet below. 4.3 seconds, every time, a measurement that reassured him the water still flowed, that his life's work hadn't been some fever dream born of desperation and impossible hope. Morrison never stopped innovating, never stopped pushing the boundaries of what human ingenuity could accomplish when survival was at stake. He developed the double-wall casing system that prevented contamination of deep aquifers, ensuring that water drawn from ancient sources remained pure enough to save lives rather than spread disease. His flow measurement tools became industry standards, precise instruments that could calculate water pressure and volume with accuracy that wouldn't be surpassed for decades. The wealth that flowed from Morrison's wells allowed him to pursue projects that revealed the true scope of his vision. He funded geological surveys that mapped underground water sources across the entire Southwest, creating the first comprehensive understanding of aquifer systems that would later guide federal water policy. He established schools that taught both traditional indigenous water-finding techniques and cutting-edge engineering, bridging knowledge systems that most people considered incompatible. But perhaps Morrison's greatest innovation was social rather than technical. Every Deep Wells Company operation employed diverse teams that reflected the multicultural wisdom that had made the original well possible. Chinese explosives experts worked alongside African water dowsers and Mexican geological mappers, creating a workplace culture that judged people by their contributions rather than their ancestry. In an era when racial segregation was becoming institutionalized across the American South, Morrison's wells became islands of integration that proved cooperation could accomplish the impossible. Morrison died on September 15, 1891, his weathered hand clutching a small glass vial filled with water from his first well. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew him, a man whose life had been defined by bringing water to the surface, holding tight to that original source as his own life ebbed away. 5,000 people attended his funeral, representing every culture and social class that had found life at his wells. The gathering looked like nothing else in 1890s America. Comanche chiefs standing beside German immigrants, Chinese railroad workers sharing grief with Mexican ranchers, freed slaves paying respects alongside former Confederate soldiers who had learned that survival transcended old hatreds. Comanche Chief White Eagle spoke of water as the blood of the earth, praising Morrison for listening to ancient wisdom that connected all living things to the sources that sustained them. Chen Wei's son played a bamboo flute melody that had once echoed in the depths of the original shaft, notes that rose into the Texas sky like prayers for rain. The formerly enslaved community of Freedom Town, a settlement that had grown entirely around one of Morrison's wells, sent a choir that sang spirituals about crossing rivers to freedom, songs that took on new meaning when the rivers were hidden deep beneath the earth. Today, more than a century later, Morrison's original well still flows, protected as a historical monument that draws hydrologists and historians from around the world. Modern geological surveys confirm what Morrison somehow understood through intuition and inherited wisdom. He had tapped the Edwards Trinity Aquifer at a point where confined pressure ensures centuries of continued flow and water that will outlast every structure human beings have built on the surface above. Every August 15th, descendants of Morrison's team and the thousands of people he saved gather for the Festival of Deep Waters, a celebration that honors both the man and the multicultural collaboration that made his impossible dream possible. Participants bring water samples from wells across the continent, pouring them into a common vessel that represents the interconnected nature of all underground water sources. Dr. Elena Morrison Chen, Jake Morrison's great-great-granddaughter and a leading groundwater hydrologist, recently used ground-penetrating radar to map the original well with 21st-century precision. What she discovered would have amazed even her legendary ancestor. Morrison had actually dug not one but 3 separate shafts, creating redundancy systems that anticipated engineering principles that wouldn't be formally recognized for another century. At the festival's end, Following a tradition that began the year after Morrison's death, a child chosen by lottery drops a piece of turquoise, honoring Morrison's Cherokee grandmother, into the well. Everyone present counts the seconds, until the splash echoes back from the depths. 4.3, exactly as Morrison recorded in his journal on the day water first rose from the earth's hidden rivers to save a dying land. That sound, stone striking ancient water far below the surface, carries more than just measurement data. It carries the echo of human determination, refusing to accept that the impossible must remain impossible. It honors the memory of people who understood that survival sometimes requires digging deeper than anyone has ever dared, trusting that the earth holds secrets worth discovering for those brave enough to descend into darkness in search of light. In the end, Jake Morrison's legacy flows not just through the aquifers he tapped, but through the knowledge that when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, the answer sometimes lies not in accepting limitations, but in digging deeper than anyone thought possible, and trusting that persistence, innovation, and the wisdom of those society overlooks can transform the impossible into the inevitable.